Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to show you how to install Proxmox on a QNAP NAS. Now, a number of you may have old QNAP devices knocking around your home or business environment. Maybe you've bought a brand new one and you're utilizing QTS5 that the system arrives with, or UTS5 if you're going for a more powerful system. And although you enjoy using the QNAP virtualization station tool, you want a virtual machine hypervisor that lives directly on the bare metal. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how to use and how to install, I should say, the Proxmox open source virtual machine hypervisor platform. Now, why would you use Proxmox? Well, because it's open source. Although there are a number of big key players in the kind of hypervisor virtualization software sector like Hyper-V and VMware, it should be said that the majority of the real standout aspects of their feature set are behind subscription services or on larger payment tiers within their platform. Whereas Proxmox, although its design is a little bit more dated in some areas, not a lot, but just a little, it should be said that all of its features and services, with the exception of some of the community support ones from Proxmox themselves, are included within the open source platform. Things like high availability and a lot of the kind of asset management internally within the VMs. So, what do you need to do this? Well, let me just go through the list for you guys. Number one, you're going to need a QNAP NAS. You're going to need a QNAP NAS with minimum an x86 based processor there. So I'm going for one here, the TS464, a relatively recent release from the brand. But pretty much any that is an x86 processor can be used. Now, obviously, being able to run Proxmox is one thing, but you're going to make sure the whole point of Proxmox is a multi-VM supporting tool. So you want to make sure you've got a CPU that at the very least can run at least a couple of VMs there, and that counts for containers too. Another great thing about Proxmox running both VMs and containers side by side on the bare metal. Next, you're going to need, I would say, at least 4 gig of memory there. Now, when I say at least, I would recommend definitely higher than that. I'd say minimum 8 to 16. I'm going to be upgrading the 4 gig of memory this arrives with another 8 gig stick. And again, I'll do some links later on to the components that I'm either utilizing today or suitable alternatives. Again, that is optional extra, but I would minimum go 8 gig personally, but you can get away with 4 gig. Next thing you're going to need, optional, is an M2 NVMe, because although you can run Proxmox from a SATA drive inside your NAS, it's a real shame to lose some of the internal storage there, and the majority of QNAP NASs released in the last 2 to 3 years all arrive with an M2 NVMe slot inside, a much faster area of storage, and this is what we're going to be installing Proxmox onto, so we can run all our VMs from within the NAS. But bear in mind, this is optional. You can run Proxmox from hard drives if you choose. They're just not going to run anywhere near as well. Or you can use SATA SSDs within the individual base. Just bear in mind then you're losing a base. So if you've got a QNAP NAS with either a PCIe upgrade slot for a card that can mount M2s, or it has an available M2 slot inside, I would recommend installing one of them. You don't need to go very, very high for Proxmox. Just really, compensate for the VMs you're going to be installing. So if you're only going to run Proxmox from it and run VMs on the storage, you can get away with something as small as 60 or 120 gig SSD, but again, scale it to your needs. Next, you're going to need a USB drive, something I'll show you later on. I personally use a SanDisk one here. This is a USB 3 micro small form factor one. Normally I use this because a lot of the NAS brands I talk about have internal USB bays. This one doesn't, so the size of the USB physical size isn't a huge factor, but I would still recommend the little SanDisk ones. One, because I've tested them on all the NAS brands and they work, and secondly, it's incredibly small, and the odds of it getting accidentally knocked out at any point are pretty slim indeed. And again, I'll put a link to this later in the video and in the description. Finally, you're going to need a keyboard, video, optional mouse setup, because the first part of the installation of Proxmox is conducted local. That is utilizing an HDMI output and USBs for your accessories here. Now, a mouse is optional. It will make the installation a little bit easier to navigate, but not vastly. So if you don't have a USB mouse, you can get away with a standard USB keyboard like this old Microsoft one that I'm using in today's video. And you will also need an HDMI monitor, or of what I'm going to be utilizing, a capture card like this one. So if you've got an HDMI monitor, you'll be fine. That will do the job perfectly. But for my sake, so I can record everything I'm showing you today, I'm going to be using an HDMI capture box that will be connecting this NAS to this PC. So now you know the hardware you're going to need. I think what we should do is make our way over to the laptop to show you the software that you're going to need to download and what to do. But the first thing we're going to do is get our USB drive like this one, and we're going to attach it to our USB down here next to me, because one of the things you want to make sure is that USB drive is clean and doesn't have any existing partitions, doesn't have any existing data on it. So the first thing I'm going to show you when we make our way to the laptop is a much faster way to completely clean that USB drive. Let's make our way over to the laptop. Okay, so now we're connected into the system here. You can see that now I've connected that USB drive. It's saying this drive needs to be formatted, and that's because there's multiple partitions already on this drive from other use. So if we come out of it there, we'll ignore all the errors and stuff. We'll silence the mic there. What we need to do is, if you make our way into the system here, you'll be able to see on the PC list there that it's actually listing multiple drives there because of those partitions. And we need to get rid of those before we start the next thing. So what we need to do is go into our main menu and type in the word disk part. And again, you can either tap enter or just select that option that appears there on screen. If you see a black screen while I'm doing this, that's just Windows looking for authentication and permission. So what you need to do at this point is type in the words list disk. So I typed in list disk. So again, type that there. And as you can see, it's got those three drives connected. One's my OS drive, another drive is a backup drive that I've got connected into a SATA port, and that third one is our SanDisk USB. So we want to select disk 2. So we put in select disk 2. Once you've selected that, you need to type in the word clean and click enter. Bear in mind, by doing this, you will wipe that drive entirely. So make sure there's nothing on there that's particularly important. Now that drive has been completely formatted, and not only has it removed all of those partitions, but it's removed any kind of existing volume or anything there on the drive, as you can see, because now it's disappeared from our list of drives, even though it is still connected to my physical system there. So now we'll go over to the apps and images that you need to download. The first thing is to head over to proxmox.com/en/downloads, and from there download the latest version of the ISO installer. This is an image, a digital image that's more often burnt to a disc, an optical media disc like a CD, DVD or Blu-ray, but of course our QNAP doesn't have a CD, DVD or Blu-ray drive, but more on that in a moment. Go ahead and download that latest version of the installer. I've already installed it, so I'm just going to cancel it there, but you let it finish and make note of where you're downloading it, presumably in your /downloads folder. Next, you're going to need an application called Rufus. Now Rufus allows you to turn images, ISO images and virtual image disks into USB deployables, and that is how we're going to get the QNAP to see that Proxmox installer image there. So you need to download either the full version, or you can download the kind of portable version, which is a double-click open up executionable there. I would download the portable version, but again, that's really up to you which best suits your needs. Again, as mentioned, this is the USB I'm utilizing here today, and again, this is only really going to be used for this installation, but if you plan on utilizing this USB to also to store some of your images, your bigger image, your virtual machine ISOs and VDMKs and stuff like that on the USB, so you can connect into there to transfer them over to Proxmox, get a larger drive, but you can also upload them to Proxmox via the web browser over the IP as well. But nonetheless, this is the USB that I'm using today. Equally, when it comes to an M2 NVMe, if you're going to install an M2 NVMe, once again, scale depending on the size of your Proxmox, overall virtual machine deployment and containers, and if you're going to use dummy files in there or store snapshots. But again, bear in mind that you may also be using some of the main SATA bays of your QNAP NAS system, and it's also got 2 NVMe slots in the case of this QNAP, so you've got more options. But personally, For this installation, I'm going very small, and I'm only utilizing a small drive there. Last up, memory upgrades. Again, it's going to depend on your system. I've got a 4 gig here that I'm also upgrading with a further 8 gig. I'm going for a crucial module there, and that's DDR4 3200 megahertz. But again, make sure you check what your upgrade options are on your individual QNAP NAS, because it may be a DDR3, and if you're watching this in the future, maybe even DDR5. But once you've downloaded both Rufus and Proxmox, Rufus you can automatically boot up if you choose directly from your downloads folder. So if we go into our downloads folder, as you can see there, I've downloaded a multitude of different images there, and there is Proxmox, that virtual image, and there is the Rufus deployable. So I'm going to double click that, click yes, and then on the middle of the screen will be the Rufus installation area. There is the USB that we've connected that has no real local identity on the disk management. Then we need to click the select tab, and then from select, head into our download section and then find, in our case, the Proxmox image there. You can tell it's the image because it's the picture of a disk in the white background as an ISO, and then click open. And then from there, it will let you know that you've selected an ISO hybrid image there. They've not made it a compatible ISO copy file method contained image, but you can go ahead and force the system to convert into that USB bootable, which is what we're going to be doing. From there, when you're ready, click next. Bear in mind, when you do this, once again, you are going to wipe that USB. So just know that you don't have any important data on there if you didn't use this part earlier. Now, it will again warn you, just like I had, and it will begin converting that ISO into a bootable USB for our QNAP NAS. I'm double checking that OBS is running there in the background. So while it's doing that, this is when you want to start setting stuff up on your piece, your NAS there. So again, I've already done that in the background. I've installed the M2 NVMe inside this NAS. I've also put the memory upgrade inside as well. On the rear of the system, I've got my power connector ready, and I've connected an Ethernet cable there at the back. As you can see there on screen, the Proxmox installation is completed, and it's already started creating all of those partitions that Proxmox needs to separate across the USB. So if we go in to the My PC area, you're able to see that the partitions have been created there. So again, we can come out of those as we see fit. As we go for that there, and we see that it's finished on Rufus there, so we can go ahead and close Rufus. I know you can't see this on the bottom right of the screen because my face is in the way, but do make sure to right click on the bottom right of the screen and safely eject the USB drive on your local machine, which is what I've done. So you take that USB and you place it inside ideally a USB 3 port, but it's really up to you. Again, unlike some systems that have an internal USB port, this one we're going to have to use one of our external ports. So we've got that USB now installed in our QNAP NAS. We've attached the power, we've attached the LAN, we've connected the USB. The next thing we have to make sure we connect is our USB keyboard, because we're going to need the USB keyboard for when we interface with this locally. So I'm going to pop that in there. And finally, we need to connect our capture card, which is what we're going to install here. But again, remember, you can just connect to a normal monitor. And once all of that's connected, I'm going to put that down there. I'm going to attach my capture card into this PC. And then we're going to get ready to boot our QNAP NAS to start the process. So I'm just going to quickly restart OBS to make sure that card has been identified there. Be back in just a moment. Right, so now we've connected everything up and I've got the NAS connected to my monitor. What we need to do is get ready with our USB connected keyboard into that NAS and hover over that delete button there. Now, depending on the NAS you're utilizing from QNAP, the motherboard does change. So maybe you need to spam the F2 key or perhaps the F12 key, but normally the delete button will do the job. The reason we're doing this is because we need to get into the BIOS of our QNAP NAS system. We need to get in. We need to stop the device trying to boot from the internal SSD. All QNAPs arrive with a small area of SSD flash referred to as the DOM or the DOM, and that is where QNAP software lives. So if you allow the system to boot from that first, it will then boot into the QTS operations, and and eventually boot into the QNAP NAS software. And what we want to do is redirect the system to boot from that USB we've connected there on the back. So what I'm going to do is hold that power button. You may hear the system quite close to the microphone. And the system's going to start to boot. And now I'm just going to tap that delete button so we can get the system to go into BIOS there. So I apologise for the clicking there you can hear on screen. The other thing I will highlight with this NAS is I got it populated with 14 TB Seagates inside. So you are going to hear those drives quite close to this camera there. We're waiting for that beep noise there, and what we want to do is on screen see the system go into that BIOS manager there for us. And we are in. But again, bear in mind, if you have got all the way to the bootloader sequence there from the QNAP side, you'll be able to tell because it will let you know you're booting into that Linux OS. Then you may need to restart and try one of the other keys. But at least in the case of the TS464, that delete button works for us. So what we need to do now we're in the BIOS is make our way over to the boot options here. And as you can see, by default, the QNAP OS drive, the internal flash module there, that DOM, is our default. And what we want to do is change it now to the USB drive. So we want to make sure the USB is the first thing that's being booted from there. Later on, we're going to be coming back into BIOS and make sure we change it to that NVMe, or we can go ahead and change it now to that NVMe, as we can see, which is that 128 gig SSD that I've installed inside. So later on, when we install Proxmox on that and remove the SSD, the system will automatically boot from that NVMe. Bear in mind, later on, if you want to reverse the system back to its original QNAP identity, just make sure you come back into BIOS as you see here and change that identity there for that back to that QNAP eMMC OS drive. So again, just remember that if you want to reverse this back to QNAP and its OS, you can go to it there. Also remember, if you've got data on the drives within the QNAP OS, if you do install Proxmox and try to run some VMs, I hate seagulls, if you try to do that, you may format those drives. So if you do have data sets and the whole layout of your QNAP data on the drives inside the QNAP, remove those drives, put them to one side, and use fresh drives inside your NAS with Proxmox. Man alive, that is loud, isn't it? Now, again, what I've done is fresh drives inside there, so that's what I'm going to be utilising for this. But later on, if you want to switch it back, take those drives that you put elsewhere from your QNAP setup, power down the device, reinstall those drives, and then remove the USB, go back into BIOS, and make sure the system goes back into that QNAP SSD boot there. But for now, we've changed the identity to the USB first, followed by the NVMe. So now what we can do is save changes and exit, and the system will reboot, but this time from that USB drive. So now it goes directly into that Proxmox installer while I go on the roof and start taking out seagulls, and from here we begin our Proxmox installation. Now in the advanced options there, you can run in a debug mode, you can do a rescue boot to repair and recover your existing Proxmox setup if there's any data on the SSD, or you can do a test of your system's memory to make sure there's no inconsistencies. But for now, we're going to click escape and go back into the installing of Proxmox VE. And what it will do now is it will start preparing the Proxmox bootloader there. So this can take anywhere up to about 30 to 60 seconds, depending on the power of your system and the later revisions of Proxmox there, which have built in a few extra little odds and sods there in terms of the bootloading installation. But once it's done, you'll be presented with a grey screen there. Again, we're utilising just the keyboard today, but the next few options, if you do have a mouse, they are a little, like the tiniest bit easier for a lot of users out there. It's still not much, but as you can see with that mouse there on screen, I'm just going to move myself here on OBS because we're going to need the bottom right of the screen there. But for now, what we can do is start making our way through the terms and conditions, and if you want to agree to them, use the tab button on the keyboard to flick between each of the options and then highlight agree. From there, it's going to ask you where you want your installation to take place. So in my case, you can choose which block you want to go for. For me, I'm going for the NVMe, but if you want to install it on one of the SATA drives that are connected on the system, or if you've got another connected drive, you can use one of those, but it is highly advised to install Proxmox at least on an SSD SATA, but definitely recommend an NVMe. Don't go for a USB, because you're going to be both reading and writing onto this storage area when running your containers and VMs within Proxmox. So for now, I'm going to go for that M2 NVMe, or you can maybe target the internal DOM that QNAP include with the system. I would not recommend installing on that, because then you're overwriting the actual QNAP installation, and then you cannot recover your QNAP NAS. Yes, if you're running the system outside of hardware warranty anyway, QNAP were never going to support you on the hardware side outside of that 3 to 5 year warranty, but still nonetheless, I'd still not recommend overwriting that internal DOM at all. So for now, we can go down to the next option, and from here enter your location, in my case the United Kingdom, and then just slowly make your way down to next, and obviously change your keyboard layer and language appropriate to your own location. From there, give the system a password, and again, this is going to be your main root password here. So remember, the initial login is going to be root, lowercase r-o-o-t, and you can change that later, as well as including your email if you choose for the other assisted Proxmox services. From there, click next, and then as you can see, it's now going to invite you to set up the device for the first time and its network configuration there, and its default IP, as well as the host name as well. So you can go ahead and set those up as appropriate to your own configuration. And finally, we're on the summary page here, where you're able to see a breakdown of the choices and configuration options you have made thus far. Now, I would recommend scrolling down to where it says automatically reboot after successful installation and unclicking that option. The reason being that during the reboot process, when the system reboots, it's going to try and read from that USB first time again. And what we want to do is power down the system, disconnect that USB, and then boot the system for Proxmox to load from that M2 NVMe inside. But for now, what we can do is go into install and then click enter. And then from there, it will begin the installation of Proxmox here on our QNAP NAS. This can take just a few minutes depending on the complexity of your system, and will be done very shortly. And now that installation has completed. As you can see, Proxmox VE is now ready to go. They've even given us our IP to play with. So now all we need to do is reboot that system. And what it will do now is start the reboot system. But what it will do is also power down first. So it allows us to remove that USB drive there, as I accidentally select the wrong screen there on OBS. Bring that over there to that corner. And now it's allowing us to remove that USB drive there, and the system will now begin its reboot process after removing that drive. And then from there, it will load in to that Proxmox installation that we just created there. So we've heard the beeping, it has started. The system is now not going to access the onboard flash DOM from QNAP there. It's going to be running from the second option that we selected there on BIOS, which was of course that M2 NVMe inside. As you can see, it's going to boot into that system there, and then shortly it will go into the installation process for Proxmox. Once it does that, what we'll do is we'll switch over to a web browser on the local system. We won't need this anymore, and then we'll be able to make our way into the Proxmox GUI via the web browser here on my local PC. This is still outputting what we see here on the GUI of the HDMI output, but don't worry, you don't need to do any of that. I'm just saving us just a few seconds while the system gets ready to boot us directly into Proxmox there, as you can see there on screen. And it's trying to do the output. We're going to allow it to skip through all of that and go straight into the web browser now. And now we're going to switch over to the web browser to log into our Proxmox installed QNAP NAS. Just made the switch over to screen recording there on OBS and did a quick restart of the system because of my network configuration, and that's why the IP has changed, but for you it should remain exactly the same. And as you can see there is the new IP there at the top, and I'm not using the keyboard from earlier. I can just go ahead and use directly into the interface there, via the web browser on that IP, and now it's logging me into Proxmox. It will ask you if you've got an existing subscription to the Proxmox subscription there. Again, you don't need to have that, but you can have it for some of the remote access and some of the advantages that it presents to you. And as you can see, there is our Proxmox installation there on the QNAP. Double checking OBS is running there, and again, from this point, you know, the world is your oyster. You can go ahead and do a number of different things. You can go ahead and start creating your VMs if you choose up here, start adding them, you know, using some of those OS images. Now again, if you've got a bigger USB drive, you could have loaded some ISOs onto this afterwards and popped it in that QNAP, or you can go ahead and upload ISOs directly by navigating some of the options in the server storage area here. And again, all the options are moderately self-explanatory. Some of them need a little bit more work, and there are, you know, better users than myself out there that provide a number of different guides with regards to adding additional storage on these devices, as well as adding some of those ISOs directly from within the web browser. But there you go. Now you have installed Proxmox on your QNAP NAS, and remember, if you want to roll back towards the QNAP installation, what you can do is power the device down and then make sure you don't have that USB device connected. Go back into the BIOS like I showed you earlier on with the HDMI output, and then just rechange the order of the boot devices with that QNAP OS eMMC SSD there at the top of the boot pile. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video guide helpful. Again, there should be a written version coming very, very soon, linked below, that I recommend you check out. If you need any further assistance on other different NAS systems, or maybe you've hit a wall during your Proxmox installation, use the free advice section below. You can use the comment section, but we get a lot of comments every day here on YouTube, and it's just hard to stay on top of them, whereas if you use the free advice section there, at least then they are in a chronological order, and we can, you know, attend to them as best we can. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hate seagulls, and I will see you next time.